I think people are still arriving, so welcome everybody. I imagine we're still going to see more and more faces joining us in the next 5 minutes. So welcome to this webinar on exploring neurodiversity. And we have the highest numbers for any webinar, which just shows the interest in this topic. So we've got about 151 people signed up. So welcome everybody. And in a moment, I'll welcome our guests. But just before we start, to say this webinar has been organised by the CDI's Community of Interest for Private Practice. And if you're a private practitioner and you're not a member, please do think of joining. I'm Leanne Hambley, I'm one of the members of the steering group. And we have quite a few webinars really targeted at private practitioners, but also ones like this, which are for everybody. Okay, so in terms of technical issues, if you do have technical issues, please pop them in chat and Ashley will try and sort them out. We are recording because, as usual, these are put on the website for the CDI members afterwards, and our guests have kindly agreed to share their slides with us after. So thanks for that. And I think that's it in terms of the housekeeping. They will talk themselves about how they'll manage questions and popping them into chat, so I'll let them do that bit. So with that, I'm very, very delighted to welcome Katie Fernandes and Sarah Breen. Now, I met as in our usual way of meeting nowadays, which is online at a conference in the USA. So they're both coming to us 10 o'clock in the morning from the East Coast. And they have snow. They have 5 to 6 feet of snow there, so proper New England winter weather. So Katie Fernandes is an academic skills specialist at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. And Sarah Breen is the Assistant Director of Career Counselling at Emmanuel College in Boston, Massachusetts. And so I welcome both of them, and I will hand over to them for the rest of the session.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Katie Fernandes, and Sarah is with us as well. I will begin to share my screen. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to direct those in the chat.
Yeah, I'll be monitoring the chat throughout, so feel free to put any questions in there, and I'll do my best to kind of incorporate those as we go through, and maybe we'll have a little bit of time at the end to also kind of address any questions anyone has. So we can go ahead and we'll just get started. So you probably saw the description for this earlier. We're going to be talking about supporting clients who are neurodiverse. So Katie and I have experience in working specifically in programs for students and clients who are neurodiverse. And by neurodiverse, we mean those with diagnosed learning challenges. So autism, dyslexia, dysgraphia, nonverbal learning disorder, and how to go about working with, people whose minds might work a little bit differently than, what is neurotypical. So on the next slide, we have our agenda.
So today we'll be going through our introductions and welcome, which we've already started to do. We'll talk about mindset and neurodiversity, strategies to support all learners, right? Because the work we're doing is not just beneficial for those that are neurodiverse, but all learners. Effective career counseling, tips and tricks that we have found through practice to be very beneficial. We'll touch on motivational interviewing, and then we'll dive into some case studies. We have provided assistive technology that we've had students and clients use to be really productive in their learning process. if we have time to go over that, but we will provide that in our slides if we don't get to that. We'll suggest some resources, and then we'll do a little bit of a reflection with takeaways and then our references. So hello again, my name is Katie Fernandes. I'm an academic skills specialist at Providence College, which is a small, around 5,000 students, private Catholic school. Sarah and I met working at Dean College in the Arch Learning Community, which is a program for students specifically diagnosed with learning disabilities and challenges. And so through that, we have found the partnership of career exploration and tailoring our approach to students' learning profile and style, great success. So since our time at Dean, we've continued to collaborate in all the work that we've done, and we wanted to share what we found to be beneficial, but also some of our challenges as well.
And I'm Sarah Breen. I'm the Assistant Director of Career Counseling at Emmanuel College, which is around a 2,000 student school. It's a very small school in Boston, Massachusetts. And in working with Katie in the Arch Learning Community at Dean College, we had the opportunity to have access to students' diagnostics, which isn't always the case when working with clients or students. So this presentation isn't meant to figure out how to diagnose people, but rather to understand some verbal or physical cues to know that, implementing some other techniques and strategies is what's going to be most beneficial. And so we'll go through some of those, cues and also some of those different tactics that we've used. So when we talk about the brain's executive functions, this is kind of a general overview of what we mean. So every brain is set up in a way to have these different aspects in them. So activation, focus, effort, emotions. And underneath each of these, you'll be able to see, exactly what that means. So in terms of activation, that's the brain's ability to organize, to prioritize, to be able to sit down and go through work and get work done. Adding in a diagnosed learning challenge affects the abilities in these different executive functions. So when we're talking about executive function, someone might have a lower activation ability or might not be able to manage their emotions as well. So those aspects might be affected. What's interesting is that there are studies that have shown that, if the activation is lower, that allows for more space for memory. So I've worked with students who don't have very good social skills, they don't have very good focus, but put a complex math problem in front of them and they'll do it in a heartbeat. So being able to understand, how these can certainly fluctuate is really important. So you can kind of take a look at these different aspects. And being able to work with people and understanding these, you can really be that motivational factor for someone and being able to understand them and connect with them and communicate with them in a really, healthy way for success.
One thing too, Sarah, we work as a strength-based approach, right? So finding what the student or client really excel at and how to maybe look at these other areas such as focus or memory and how to strengthen those. But knowing, that a student is really strong with, let's say, their organization, working with that student or client to say, okay, this is your strength. How can we help that shine through in your learning process and how that transitions when you are coming out of a structured school environment? All right, so we want to hear from you. Who was the person that was most influenced, you throughout your academic or your career journey. So who is that person? You can think of maybe someone that you worked with for a short period of time but made a lasting difference, or maybe a mentor. And what we'll do is I'm going to invite you to annotate. So we're going to use this slide here for you to actually annotate and put in who that person was. You can put a name or a title, whatever you choose is best. If you're having difficulty with the annotation, we can walk through and have you do the chat. So how you annotate is you bring your mouse to the top of the screen. You'll click on the annotate or the down arrow, and then using the text, the draw, the stamp, whatever you need to fill in. So awesome. We already have someone typing in dad. Wonderful. Guidance counselor.
Leanne.
Leanne. Who knows? Right. So thinking about who that person was, and maybe even, you know, what their approach was to supporting you. Your aunt. Wonderful. Supervisor. That's great to see. Music teacher, colleague, team lead.
In the chat, I'm seeing teacher, mom, parents.
Wonderful.
Colleagues, guidance counselors, former manager.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My wife. Love that.
Aw.
Husband. Yes.
So these supportive people in our lives can really come from so many different places. And so I think what we can kind of see from this is that all of these people, it's really about how they worked with you and how they communicated with you to help you understand what was going on and helping you move forward. So, you know, you can be that influential factor in really anyone's life in any capacity, as a mom, a brother, a wife, a teacher, parent, a supervisor, a lecturer. I love that. Music teacher. So being able to implement these different tactics that we're talking about, you know, you really can be such a helpful, influential factor in someone's life, in your client's life.
Absolutely. I think it's helpful for us to go back and think about our own experience and be reflective to see maybe if we have any of those same qualities, right, that our mentors or our leaders or family members possess to help us. So this is wonderful. Thank you everyone for sharing. I'm going to clear the annotations. All right, so this slide we felt was very important to use and start off our conversation as we dive into neurodiversity and what that looks like. As you can see from left to right, we have equality, equity, and then justice. And I think the visual really helps to give us a good framework to the work that we are doing and how we can get there. So really stepping back, not being judgmental, and really being open to hearing everyone's experience and need, and then meeting that individual, that client, where they're at, and thinking about those that qualify for accommodations, right? So that's an opportunity to level the playing field. So accommodations in the workplace might include, you know, some physical accommodations in the office, certain, depending upon the environment that you work in or your client works in, or maybe it's some having everything written down or having something extended or explained, having a verbal dialogue about processing a task or a project that they're working on. So thinking about how we can continue to, through our work, make sure that there is equity, but more so justice for everyone that we are working with. And I even encourage you to think about yourself and your own professional experience as well.
Yeah, so, and I think, what Katie, what you're getting at is really like giving people the tools they need to be successful. So, we can, like these pictures show, like we can give people a box to stand on, but, is that helping them, or is it better to give them the tools they need to be successful on their own, to go off and, live their life knowing that they have this toolbox to be successful?
Absolutely. One of, in the United States, we have what we call FERPA. So it is a law for students when they get over 18 and they come into college that, they are the only ones that have access to their educational records. And so as a staff member, I can only speak to the student about their educational records, which is definitely a new journey for our students and clients who are neurodiverse, because they have a lot of family involvement and their families are there to advocate and to support them. But exactly what Sarah is saying is we need to guide them to have their own toolbox. How do they advocate for themselves? So I always think that this guideline, FERPA, is really finding that balance between challenge and support, right? We don't want to enable them, but really figuring out how we can best support them to really make this robust toolkit, if you will. All right, so mindset and neurodiversity. I think it's really important to outline these two categories, neurodiversity and mental health, but being aware that they definitely have a lot of comorbidity and overlap. So on the left-hand side, these are some of the common neurodiversity that Sarah and I have worked with and seen. So specific learning disability with reading, there's dyslexia, specific math disability, dyscalculia, writing disability, dysgraphia, nonverbal learning disability. So that is close, sometimes closely mixed up or undiagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. We have receptive and expressive language, pragmatic language, and executive functioning, which Sarah had touched upon as well. So the reason that we're giving, these examples, again, is not for diagnostic purposes, but really to be aware of the different needs that our clients have. And a lot of what we're seeing in the United States is on the left-hand side, these are really prevalent, but also they blend into the mental health on the right-hand side. So different types of anxiety challenges, general anxiety disorder, which is GAD, post-traumatic stress, obsessive compulsion, mood disorders. Also, we're seeing a lot more of depression, bipolar, ADHD, disruptive disorder, so oppositional defiant disorder as well. These are, I sometimes say that they're catchphrases or catchwords because people use them a lot. And, when we're working with students, we don't want to put them into a box. We just want, as educators, to be aware of how many different learning profiles and types of brains there are, so we can individually support each client with their specific needs.
So in terms of, like Katie said, we're not diagnosing, but rather we're looking at different aspects of how these present. So you may be working with a client and they have particularly slow processing. So one of the examples that I love that Katie uses is, everyone's brain is like a computer, but not everyone has the same processing chip in their computer. So, you might be working with one client who has, the brand new Apple Mac, but you have another student who's, working with like the 1997 Gateway computer. So being able to see those differences, it may show as a slower processing or not being able to, use the different tones in their voice for emphasis, or having less of an affect on their face, not having a proper perception of reality or of the world. They can often be seen as being really inattentive or bored because they're not really showing an emotional aspect. They might seem withdrawn or really slow to respond to questions, or not really engaging, when in fact these people that we've worked with really are engaged and really do want this information. They just don't express their feelings and their emotions in the same way. And so oftentimes from the emotional aspect, a lot of these people that I've worked with have, I've had students open up to me about, because they were perceived, as being neurodiverse and a little bit different, they were often bullied growing up. So they have a lower self-esteem. They have a really high sense of, that fear of failure, and hold themselves to a really high standard, and often feel embarrassed or shamed if something doesn't go as well as they wanted it to. They often, might not have as many friends or as many social connections, so they can come off as more immature because they haven't developed those skills. Or they might not be able to regulate their emotions as well. I've certainly had clients that I've worked with start yelling, and I know that they're not yelling at me, but rather, that's their way of being able to express themselves because they're upset in the moment, but don't know how to, regulate that emotion. Because if you remember on the chart we looked at, emotion is one of those executive functions. So they might come off as aggressive or frustrated. And so what we're going to get into is talking more about different communication styles and being able to diffuse the situation and really help them understand and create that bonded connection. So these are some of those symptoms or aspects of what you would see from a behavioral aspect without knowing a diagnosis.
Absolutely. And I think behavior is an indicator for us to understand our clients' brain and functioning, and how their computer is processing information. So it's something to just be aware of. I did notice in the chat there was mention of gender as well. So again, all of these different neurodiversities and mental health challenges present differently in everyone, which I think for me personally is why I love the work that I do, is because every client and student is different. So trying to figure that out for me is like a puzzle. It is an exhausting puzzle, right? We do get tired at times because there's so much change with each individual we're working with. So I do thank you for making that point. I think it's a very valid and important one to note.
So when we're working with the clients, one of the best communications or tactics that Katie and I like to use is understanding their thinking pattern. So we talked about how these people might have been bullied, they don't have a lot of social skills. They tend to come from a perspective of negative self-talk. So I can't do this, it's not going to work, I'm not good enough. So I feel like a lot of what I do in my counseling sessions is trying to pump my clients up with confidence and saying, I understand, this seems really difficult, but let's break this down into steps, and we'll go one step at a time, and know that I'm here to help support you along the way, but also know that you are an amazing person. You've got the skills. And I will go through their resume and say, like, look at all these things that you've done. Look at all these skills that you have. I want you to be able to see this and know that you are qualified to go on to this position or to think about going into this industry. And really being able to switch that thinking. There are definitely studies that have been done that show, optimistic versus pessimistic thinking, and how that way of thinking can really affect so many aspects of someone's life, into their decision making, their relationships, their ability to move forward in different aspects of their life. So first and foremost, it's coming from a place of positivity and showing that, like, yes, you can do this, and pumping them full of confidence, I feel, is always one of the key aspects to working with this population.
Absolutely, Sarah, as you had mentioned, with resumes and identifying students' and clients' strengths, I also find that I have clients that underestimate themselves on their resume and during the interview process. So, really modeling and going through that with a fine-tooth comb with a positive mindset can make a huge difference. A lot of the times we use a growth mindset approach because that is part of our background as educators and wanting us and our students and clients to continue to learn along the way.
Yeah, so listening to clients as they're talking and seeing how they're phrasing the words. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with that will say, like, oh, I was lucky enough to get this award. Like, were you lucky enough, or did you work hard and earn it? Right? And so switching that way of talking and that way of thinking and the way of phrasing aspects can really start help changing the connections in the brain. And it's kind of like a cognitive behavioral therapy approach of changing the connections in the brain and starting to move in life in a different direction.
Absolutely. So how can we support all of our learners and all of our clients? We like to be proactive instead of reactive, but in the world of education and in the work we do, that's not always realistic. So these would be our goals, right? So when we're communicating, making sure we're articulating our expectations of the client and reviewing this throughout your relationship. And as you build that rapport, giving concrete examples of appropriate and inappropriate classroom or workplace behavior. And you might want to write that down, follow up with an email. That's one of my go-tos is whenever I work with a student or client, I will send them an email with notes of everything we discussed. And as we build our relationship and our rapport, I switch that and I ask the client or the student to send me follow-up from our meeting for them to kind of get into that thought process of taking notes and being reflective on their experience. So that is an exact example of modeling the behavior. Respect, of course, and encourage feedback and suggestions. Being patient, I think, is so necessary, but also give choices. So a lot of what we have talked about so far is what we do in our strategies that work for one student might likely work for others. And that's using a universal design approach, but really also tuning into what the individual needs and how their brain and thinking patterns develop.
So we got a question in the chat about ADHD and how we categorized it on a previous slide. So I just wanted to address it because it came up twice now. So we had ADHD on the mental health side on that neurodiversity slide. I think ADHD really can encompass both aspects, but here we tend to put ADHD on more of the mental health side based on the symptoms that come along with it. There are a lot of different definitions or understandings of what ADHD is. So a lot of times I see people define it as, like fidgeting a lot in class, not being able to focus. ADHD from my experience is more presenting itself as like not being able to, like going to do one task and getting distracted and going to do something else. So based on the symptoms that we have and the way we diagnose it, we put it under the mental health side, but you're right, it really does, encompass both aspects, which you'll find, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of these, you can have a learning challenge diagnosis, but then you also have this comorbidity with, anxiety and, more of those emotional aspects. So we find that ADHD from the clients that we've worked with really have that emotional aspect to it, but certainly there is that executive function to it as well. So you're right, it can be both. And a lot of these diagnoses can be both the executive function and the emotional aspect.
Absolutely. And I think that the work that we have done with our students and individuals, it is very high need. So we have not worked with an individual who just has ADHD. So exactly what Sarah was saying, the comorbidity is very significant. And so looking at how strictly specific learning disabilities, communication disabilities affect the learning and the processing. And again, as the ADHD we've seen more of the emotional regulation piece. I hope that is helpful. So what I had just touched upon was universal design, but really what we like to use is a multimodal approach, right? So as you noticed when we started our workshop, how to engage you, we had you actually participate, right? So you had to shift gears from listening and seeing with your eyes to potentially typing, using the mouse, so doing something kinesthetic, right? So making sure that we're trying to work with all different learning styles and needs. Repetition, repetition, repetition. I think I just repeat myself all the time because it's just such a habit that I have. And I know for myself, I benefit from repetition as well. Frequent check-ins. So I had mentioned the email follow-up, but also just an emotional check-in can really go a long way. And just say, especially with 2020, everything we are dealing with this pandemic, I find a lot of the time that I am just checking in to say, how's your day? Right? Using real life examples whenever possible, so there can be that relatability piece and make it more realistic can be valuable. Again, like Sarah had mentioned, listening, having patience with your client and student, but also yourself. This is a learning process for all of us. And then, as I had mentioned, we have not found one client or student that is the same. And so that engages us to do the work we do and wanting to help. But it also, we make mistakes and we need to be open and reflective about that. So I think coming back to your mentor, someone who really made a difference for you, using them as a sounding board can be really helpful. Sarah and I, if we have situations that come up with students or clients, we're like, okay, well, this is how I handled it. What are your thoughts? What can we do differently? What worked and what didn't work? It's reflective practice can be very valuable, especially with the work we do.
So in terms of communication styles, so using humor, remember we're keeping this in a positive aspect. I have found that a lot of people in this population aren't as able to understand sarcasm. They take things very literally. So certainly using humor, keeping the situation light, being flexible, creating that meaningful connection and saying, I understand this emotion that you're having. I understand confusion or the feeling of failure or, being sad or being really happy. You can never fully understand what a person is going through, but you can understand and connect to those emotions attached to the situation. And so creating that connection that way, I think, is really helpful. Giving choices. So remember that this is, at the end of the day, what is happening between you and this client in terms of career development, in terms of academics. The responsibility is on them to get it done. And so you can give them choices, but make sure that when you're giving the choices, you're not putting too much information into each one. And what I mean by that is that, so let's say you have a client come to you and say, I really want to get experience in X industry. And you say, okay, that's wonderful. I think that's a great idea. There are different ways that you can gain experience, such as A, B, and C. So now they have those different options. And remember that, if they have a slower processing speed or they, get confused very easily, we're not going to go through and say like, well, you can do A, which includes this, this, and this, or you can do B, which includes this, this, and this. Instead, we're keeping it in I don't want to say simpler ways, but we're not putting too much information in front of them at one time. So in terms of communication, we're being very straightforward and moving in steps, in smaller steps, rather than putting too much in one section. So being able to, give a break or, give another chance to help them with understanding, listening to how they're responding to you and making sure that the way they're phrasing, how they're understanding you is accurate, to really understand, is this person processing the same way that I'm trying to communicate to them? Are we really on the same page? So, obviously there are ineffective ways. So sarcasm, not really working as well. Using, personalizing too much, not being very flexible. And remembering that, repetition really is so helpful. So one of the things I do at the end of every one of my client sessions, no matter who I'm working with, is to saying like, okay, well, it sounds like we've got a really great plan in place. We're going to do this, 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 and this. And I'm here to support you along that whole route. So reach out to me if you need anything. But I've gone through and repeated exactly what we've just talked about as a way to, as like a final check in, like, okay, we're on the same plan, the same platform, right? So repetition can be really so helpful. And then if we move on to the next slide, we've got some favorite phrases. So I love these phrases, like help me understand. It sounds like you're telling me this. Is that right? My absolute favorite phrase is the last one that's listed on here, which is, does that make sense? Did I explain that well? And the reason these phrases are really helpful is because the onus of understanding is put on me rather than on the client. So sometimes, we'll say like, do you understand? And the person we're talking to will say like, yeah, of course I understand, even if they don't really, because they want to come across as competent, right? So instead of putting the responsibility on them to understand, put it on yourself to communicate properly. So they feel more comfortable with saying like, no, you didn't communicate that. I need you to repeat it in a different way. So it's my responsibility to help them make sense of what I'm saying.
I think too, Leanne had mentioned about the repetition piece, sometimes being a little hesitant to do so, but it's so important. And I think that I too am like, okay, remind me, our plan again, let's go through this. So exactly what you're saying, Sarah, put that onus on yourself. And as I had mentioned, I am happy to be vulnerable with my clients to say, it's really helpful for me if I write this down, or it's really helpful for me to repeat this again. And looking at more of our style of communication and processing information, exactly what Sarah had said. These are our favorite phrases. We use them every single day. And I'm sure you have your list as well, but sometimes these can be helpful just to have an actual list to refer to and to refresh your memory. So
I'm looking at the chat, and I know, right now there's a comment in here about working with people right now, during the pandemic and having to really do things over the phone, and how do you do things in a multimodal approach that way? So if I were working with clients, like today, I would make sure that it was over Zoom rather than a telephone call or over FaceTime, so that you have that visual aspect along with the auditory of talking through. Another technique that I would use is, in terms of career development, I'm not sure if you have this over there, but there's a company here called Candid Career, which I highly recommend looking up. They interview people in different careers, and so they're talking about what they're doing every day. And so it's that visual aspect, but also I'll use a website called onetonline.org. I'll put that link in the chat in a second, which goes through and breaks down every job into skills, abilities, daily tasks. So now we've got that visual and that auditory aspect when we can't necessarily be in front of a client physically. And I also see someone here sent a client tools in the mail, so that way you could use it, that way over Zoom, which is awesome. That ability to hold something can be really helpful.
One more thing to add, we haven't touched upon it really, but for those that are hearing impaired, when you're working with them, Google Hangout is a great way to have closed captions. So if you're able to use that, but also with Zoom, you can have your sessions recorded and have the transcript sent afterwards. So that's another way to do a follow-up. The ADA compliance officer at my institution, we've tested the Zoom transcript, and it's pretty spot on. So definitely give that a try and use our technology as best as we can. So we are going to speed through these a little bit as we want to get to our case studies.
Yes. So obviously, when working with clients, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, like we talked about, in executive functioning, maybe this is a little bit slower, is not as developed as this other area. So being able to talk with clients and really understand where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are, and then taking that and applying it to a job or applying it to the situation and how you communicate with them and how to best set them up for success. I worked with students who were like insistent on becoming a doctor, but they were failing all of their science classes. And it's like, okay, well, let's see where your strengths are. And it was in all of their management classes. So let's talk about, what that daily life is like in these different jobs and where you would be happiest and feel most successful. And also understanding that financial and living expectation. I had a student who wanted to be a preschool teacher and was insistent that she was going to buy a house in Boston, which are usually around $1 million. You're not going to be able to get that on a preschool teacher salary. So having that conversation, that candid conversation about expectations.
And ONET has salary, right, Sarah?
Sorry?
The ONET website has salary, so that can help clients.
Yes, ONET has salaries, and it also has related occupations and whether or not the industry is growing. So awesome website to use. So I'll quickly go on to the next slide in terms of what I've found in working with, clients is they have no lack of passion and wanting to be successful. What I've actually found to be one of the more difficult aspects is finding managers who know how to work with people who are neurodiverse. So a lot of times, we'll be working with someone and let's say they have like a really terrible organizational system. A manager doesn't want to necessarily have to go through and teach someone how to do it. They want someone who's going to come in and hit the ground running. So being able to, wherever you can, connect with people in the workplace and say, hey, these are some really great tactics that I've found, and how can I best help you in implementing those? So I feel like that's a really interesting part that I'm still trying to figure out how to best educate people to work, in the work setting. But that's what I've found as being one of the more challenging aspects. And then I don't know if we have time to go through. Yeah. So, okay. Case studies. Yes.
All right. So we are going to pull up some case studies for further discussion. Traditionally, we would have you all in breakout rooms, but because of the size, not complaining, very excited about all the interest. We're going to do it through chat. So I will share my screen again once more. And any feedback that you have and thoughts, we will invite you to share those through the chat. So let's start with the first one. So Anna, we'll have you read through this, and I'm happy to read it aloud. So a new client calls in asking for your career coaching services. Anna. So Anna is having a hard time keeping an office job and isn't sure why. I'm sorry, there's emergency vehicles outside my window. It's gonna get loud. It's a fire truck. Ugh, hope everyone's okay. So Anna, she is organized, gets her work done, and tries to remember every deadline. She is annoyed that her current boss will check in on her work every day and doesn't understand why. She tells you about her organization system, which you can see is very confusing, and now understand why her supervisor and colleagues are frustrated when she cannot find the right paperwork. How would you approach your conversation with Anna? So again, taking a few moments here, and you can give us some thoughts and feedback through the chat. Sarah, I'm unable to see the chat, just an FYI.
Yes, I can see it. We haven't gotten anyone yet. So based on what we've talked about, how would you best go about working with this client and helping them, understand and work to move forward? Oh, has everyone lost sound? Did everyone lose sound? Oh no, some people have sound.
Okay.
Never mind, just one person. So those who are, to all of our participants, so how would you go about, so ask them what they enjoy and what's difficult. So yes, absolutely. I will say there are times when they feel like, in this case, like Anna thinks she has a really great organizational system. And so, you could imagine just a desk piled with papers and a coworker saying, hey, I really need this report. And them not being able to find it right away and saying like, oh, I'll get it to you later. Like, no, I need it now, right? So being able to have that conversation about nuances in, the workplace. Trying to understand what a day in the office is like for her, what challenges did they feed, what feedback are they getting from the managers? So yes, so I think that's one of the best things you can do is say, what exactly is the manager saying to you? And not having them say like, oh, well, they say like, this. No, what are the exact words that they're saying to you? So you can really understand the manager's perspective without actually being able to talk to them. Talking through their organizational system, absolutely. Meeting every deadline, yes. So meeting every deadline, tell me more about that. So I love that one because we're getting an understanding of their definition of what meeting a deadline is. And is that the correct definition for the workplace? A lot of times, let's say they went through college and, they had a deadline for papers, but the professors were always really flexible. So now their understanding of a deadline is that it's flexible, but it's not in this workplace. So yes, absolutely. Unpick it all, going through their system, really understanding like, okay, if you needed to find this, how would you do it? How long would it take you? How do you feel your coworker feels when they're looking for a report and you can't get it to them right then?
Sarah, I saw one. Tell me more about what you mean, try and remember. This is interesting, right? So understanding our client's thought process and what that means. Are they writing things down? Are they reading it and being like, all right, I got it, I'll go back to it, and then completely forgetting? From my experience, and I would assume that maybe Anna struggles with some executive functioning based on if we get certain responses to these questions, right? So what do we know about those that struggle with executive functioning? Well, if we write things down, create structure. So how can Anna create more of a structure in her environment to make sure her organization makes sense for her, but also the community that what she works with, because it sounds like she needs to collaborate. And so when we have clients that are working with others, peers, that's another, we could do a whole nother workshop on that. That's in webinar. That's a whole nother approach, but that helps us as practitioners support them.
Yeah, and so the last comment I want to pull out on here is trying to find a positive angle. So yes, absolutely, keeping those positive aspects to it. So what's going well? When do you hear good things from your supervisor? And let's talk about the differences between when you get positive feedback versus when you're getting this more negative feedback. And let's see what can we alter to move all of things into the positive aspect. So absolutely, I love that.
These are great.
Yeah.
Should we do one more?
Yeah.
All right. Let's do Mark.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this big enough to see? Is that
Yeah,
better?
it's the whole screen. At least
Okay,
from my side.
perfect.
Yeah, it looks good.
So Mark is a great client. He is motivated, hardworking, and open about his struggles on the autism spectrum. He has a love of sports as a sports management major with great math skills. He is applying for jobs in the finance sector of sports organizations. He is getting interviews, but never the job offer. So you do a mock interview with him. He freezes. The person in the mock interview is not the outgoing Mark you know him to be, but his anxiety and fear of failure have accumulated to a point of shutting down. How would you approach helping Mark nail the next interview? I do want to note that these are all real life situations that we have come across. And so we found that we want to share those experiences with you in thinking of, can you relate to a client such as Mark? So how would we support?
Yeah, so what would be your reaction in working with Mark in this situation? How would you best help him, master that interview, which can already be so anxiety provoking in the first place? Ask Mark, what is he thinking? Like, what is the process of going through his mind prior to the interview and then during the interview, and what's going on in his head when he's freezing? And sometimes it's nothing, they just freeze and it's gone, right?
Find out his self-talk. Yes, love that.
Run through example questions. Absolutely. Confidence building techniques. Breathing exercises. Absolutely. There's a breathing exercise I want to talk about too. What's going on in the brain.
I think
super person poses. Yeah.
I think sometimes too, our students and clients are not as self-reflective, and that's why we need to be the investigators, right? And so they might not even realize they're freezing to the full extent that they are. So having really some self-reflective thought process or writing, or as we're on Zoom, recording, right? So recording that process so they can visually see.
Yeah, so with this person, so they clearly have anxiety. They're not able to engage in the conversation in this moment. So one of the things that I do with students and clients in this moment is absolutely breathing techniques. So one of the most interesting things that I've learned is that the body has two nervous systems, one of which controls your fight, flight, or react aspect. So whenever you're having a panic attack, if you can activate that other one, your anxiety will go down, because they both can't be activated at the same time. So a breathing technique that I will teach is nose breathing. So in through one nostril, out through the other, back in, back out. And so it's actually a technique from yoga, and doing that will activate that other system so they calm down and their brain is able to go back into working mode. The second thing that I will do is talk with them about what is it that makes them anxious? And knowing that in an interview, we want something from this other person. And when we want something from someone else, we kind of put them up on a pedestal, right? And they get really scary and big to us because we're imagining them as this almighty, powerful person up on a pedestal. So one of the techniques that I've done is I've flipped it. And I will have the client sit in my chair and I'll come in for the interview and they will interview me. so that they feel what it's like to be the interviewer, and it takes that person off the pedestal and puts them more on a grounded level. And so understanding that, I think a lot of times growing up, we tend to look, when we were kids, we looked at adults and knew that like they have some secret, they are older, they understand more. And knowing that, that's not really a thing, we're just we're just getting older, right? But we're still the same person we've always been. And so making that connection straight across is really helpful. So I'm going to go back, try to read some more in the chat.
Yeah, one person had noted about accommodations for an interview if someone identifies on the autism spectrum disorder. So Sarah and I have done a lot of community work and partnerships to figure out specifically with ASD companies that we identify that are accessible and open to working with students on the spectrum. We have an organization called Best Buddies that Sarah and I were advisors for when we worked at Dean College. And I think this is really key. So part of our conversation with Mark can be, how do we have him be reflective, identifying his strengths, why he freezes, but also making sure that the environment that he's applying to in the company is a good fit. There's many different ideologies and thoughts on asking for accommodations for an interview. And so making sure that if that's something the client knows that's an option, but also we want to set the student up and client up for success. So if they are to do that, we want to hopefully ensure that the company is going to be receptive to that, because I would imagine personally, if that were to happen to me, I'd ask for accommodations, and that goes into a whole nother legal issue. So wanting to have that network of accessible employment opportunities is always valuable in your back pocket.
One of the things, so a couple people were talking in the chat about, they love the video aspect. So there's a system that I use quite a lot, that a lot of higher ed institutions use, called Interview Stream. So I'll put that name in the chat. And so what it is, in case you have a system like this there, someone will come up on the screen and it's a pre-recorded person asking a question, and then there's a countdown, and then the student or the client answers the question and it records them. And at the end, they can send that video to their career counselor, to watch it and give feedback back. Because a lot of times, we practice questions in our head, or practice, something in our head, and then we go to say it out loud and it just comes out like a mess, right? So being able to have that practice of actually saying it out loud is so helpful.
Absolutely. So just being mindful of time, I'm just switching back. I'm sorry to disrupt our wonderful, robust conversations. So we had our debrief with our case studies. As we had mentioned earlier, we will be sending along our slides, and in our slides, we have a lot of assistive technology we found to be really helpful. So we will not be going through that with you now, but we will be sending it along. That is an example of what one of the slides would look like. Here are some resources in addition to what Sarah had provided in the chat. If you haven't heard of Landmark College, I would really recommend that you take a look at that. They're located in Putney, Vermont, so I'm sure they're getting much more snow than we are down here, Sarah. But they do a lot of wonderful research, and they have articles that come out, and it's just brilliant, the work that they're doing. And then on the right hand side down here, these are some of the resources that we tend to lean to, ONET being one of the most, and Sarah had mentioned that as well. So one last takeaway, we want to know from you in your role as a career counselor, what is helpful that we discuss. So I'm actually going to go to the next slide. So what are you going to take away from our time today and implement? And due to time, feel free to send those along in the chat as we wrap up.
Yeah, and as you're adding those things in, I do want to mention that Katie and I have an intensive planned for the CDI on January 25th, 4 to 6 p.m. your time. So we are more than happy to, absolutely sign up for that. We're more than happy to do more than one. If there are groups of people who have specific questions, or maybe you really want to do more talking about a specific topic that we've talked about, you're more than welcome to talk to your supervisor and ask about that. I'm also going to put in the chat, Katie and I offer consultation services, so I'll put that into the chat right now, where you can go in and sign up for a consultation with us.
Wonderful. And yes, we will be sending along the slides so you have them. But we do really want to thank you for your time today. And we know with our ever evolving and changing way of communication, we've had the opportunity to speak with you today, which we are very grateful for, but we would love to continue our conversations and our partnership. So feel free to reach out to us. Sarah did send our link for our private consultations, but this is our professional contact information as well.
And so we will finish just by thanking both of you so much. I think you'd agree this is it's because it's the start of the conversation, I think, isn't it? These case studies are so useful to discuss, and in the interactive, more in-depth webinar, small groups, and therefore Sarah and Katie will be able to share much more and discuss with you how to work effectively with people who have different challenges. So I think that would be really well worth attending, and thank you both very much. It's fascinating. Yes, so thank you everybody for attending, and we will be sending you a feedback link. Please do send back your feedback, and so that we can plan for other sessions. Okay, so thank you very much. Take good care. Thank you both for a brilliant presentation and for your insights. And you get lots of positive comments in the chat, as you will be able to see. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.